Okay, our Parsha Insights this week is going to take a little bit of a different path because it is Yom Haatzmaut. It's the 74th, it's 74 years since Israel was born. I'm never quite sure whether it's the 73rd Yom Haatzmaut or the 74th, but 74 years ago, actually tomorrow. Today is the 4th of Iyar, but because of nuances in the Jewish calendar and not wanting Yom Haatzmaut to fall on Shabbat and for the celebrations to detract from Shabbat, they move it up a day. So our celebrations, and that's halacha. That's actually a great example of modern halacha, because it's not just moving a birthday party, right? You're moving along with the celebration of Yom Haatzmaut. You're moving all the prayers of Yom Haatzmaut. You're moving the Haftorah. You're moving Hallel. You're moving all of these things. We said a bracha on Hallel today, even though today was not Yom Haatzmaut, because the rabbis decreed that when Yom Haatzmaut is on Friday, and when we're talking about rabbis, we're not talking about rabbis of the Talmud, and we're not talking about the Rishonim. We're not talking about Rambam and Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. We're talking about Chief Rabbi Goren. We're talking about the rabbis of the modern era, and it's just a example of modern halacha and its interpretation. So let's jump right in. I'm going to open. There we go. Give me just a moment to find the right file, and we're going to jump right into a midrash. And this is really, with apologies, this is not connected to this week's parasha. This week's parasha, Parasha Kedoshim, there's no, there certainly is no lack of fantastic midrashim on this week's parasha. So next year we'll come back around to Parasha Kedoshim. And as for this year, here we go. So we're going to jump right into Vayikra Rabbah. Our launching point today is going to be a midrash. It's a very well-known midrash, well-known in certain capacities. I actually came across an article written by Rabbi Eli Fisher in Israel, which showed the common understanding of this midrash and how the way that the world understands this midrash is actually not really found in the classical midrashim. Versions of it are found, but we'll take a look. Rav Huna Amar B'Shem Bar Kapara. So we'll read in the Hebrew. Rav Huna said in the name of Bar Kapara, Bishvil Arba Dvarim Nigalu Yisrael Mitzrayim. There are four reasons that Israel was redeemed from Egypt. And there are different versions of this. Some will say it's three things, that they didn't change. Do you know what the three things are? That they didn't change their names, right? This is a familiar midrash. They didn't change their names. They didn't change their language, and they didn't change their dress. Okay, that's one of the classic, let me just step outside the text for a moment. It's one of the classic understandings of this midrash. That version of the midrash is difficult to find. There are other versions. We're going to see another version which says four things, but that list of three things, one of the ways to remember those three things is that it makes the Rashi Tevot an acronym for the word Shalem, which is connected to Yaakov. That Yaakov came Shalem, complete. And what's Shalem? Shin is shame for their names. Lamed is Lashon for their language. And Mem is Malbush, is their clothing. They didn't change their names, their language, or their clothing. Okay, let's go back to this version of the Midrash. So he says four things. One, Shalo Shinu et Shmam, their names, Lashonam, their language. V'lo Amru Lashon Hara. They didn't tell Lashon Hara. I don't know if anyone has heard this associated with the Midrash, but that was one of the reasons. According to, there are many, many different opinions in the Midrash. This is just one voice in the Midrash as to why the children of Israel, what their merit was to be redeemed from Egypt. And according to this, one of the reasons was because they didn't tell Lashon Hara. And another, V'lo nimsa b'neim echad mehem parutz be'erva, that they weren't engaged in illicit sexual relationships. So those are we could show different midrashim, which would give different reasons, but this is this particular midrash. And then it gives some proofs. I just quoted a little bit of some of the proofs. Lo shinu et shman, they didn't change their names. Ruvain v'Shimon nachtin, so they went down to Egypt from the land of Canaan. Remember, as the tribes, they went down as their names were what? Ruvain and Shimon. Ruvain v'Shimon salkin. And when they came up 210 years later, you know what their names were? Ruvain and Shimon, the same names, right? Not necessarily the same people, obviously, but they had the same names. Velo hayu korin lihuda rupa, and they didn't call Yehuda by the name of Rupa, which is translated as Rufus, Velo Ruvain, and they didn't call Ruvain Luliani, and they didn't call Ruvain Leon. And you'll notice, I don't know what to make of this, but in the English, it's reversed, right? They didn't call Ruvain Rufus or Judah Leon. And here it says they didn't call Judah Rufus or Ruvain Leon. I don't think it really matters, right? The point is that they did, and actually the way it's translated makes a lot more sense than the way the Hebrew is rendered, because Ruvain would naturally become Rufus, and Judah would naturally, Judah with the symbol being that of the lion, would naturally be Leon. Velo Yosef, they didn't call Yosef Listus, I don't know, a very popular Egyptian name, or I'm not sure exactly what, but these are a Greek name. Velo LeBinyamin Alexandri, they didn't call Binyamin Alexander. No offense if anybody's name is Alexander, anybody has family Alexander. They're just showing these names as proof that that they didn't change their names to all of these other names. Velo Shinu et Lashonam, and they didn't change their language. And by the way, just parenthetically, there is an irony here, right? There's something I don't know, I want to say tongue in cheek, because that's a pun on the word lashon. But who is saying this teaching that they didn't change their names? Notice what his name is, Rav Huna. You ever heard of a Huna in the Torah? No, that is purely a Babylonian name. And in the name of Bar Kapara, is there a Kapara in the Torah? No, these are Babylonian names. So these rabbis who have very good, say the word goyish, but these rabbis who have very good non-biblical, non-tribal, not Reuven and Shimon names are saying, you know why Israel went out of Egypt? Because they kept their holy names. They kept their holy, there was no Adam amongst the, amongst those who went down to Egypt. It's not a particular, it became a Jewish name over time, but in terms of the Torah, it's not particular. And there actually are midrashim that deal with our customs of naming, and why in the early generation, why we name after ancestors, and in the earlier generations they actually didn't name after ancestors. Notice in the Torah, when Yaakov has his children, when the wives and the concubines have their children, they don't go through a list and saying, okay, which great grandparent do we have to name after? None of Yaakov's children are named Avraham, right? That's a very telling point, right? That none of his children are named Abraham or Sarah. And there's something worth, although he does have Serach, but there's something worth discussing there. Okay, Velo Shinu et Lashonam, and they didn't change their language, and it gives a proof text to show that they're called Ivri. Okay, so we'll just leave it at that. So the big question, which we're going to look at in a moment through the eyes of the Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk, who we've looked at before in different contexts. But the big question here is, okay, Israel was redeemed from Egypt for doing what? For not changing their names? Really? Is that your big mitzvah? If we're gonna list our mitzvot, if we're gonna take a shot at being great Jews, changing names, speaking Hebrew. I mean, these things are pretty important. Language is very important. Names are very important. Lashon Hara, right? If you would rank Lashon Hara amongst the top commandments, don't quote me on this, but it wouldn't even break the top 10. In fact, it doesn't break the top 10 because we have a top 10. we have the 10 commandments. So all these things are important. I don't want to diminish their importance, but these are the four things that kept them connected. That's crazy. Rameir Simcha Cohen Dvinsk has the same response. Okay, and we're going to look at his comment, and then move on to the poem as promised before. So at the end of the book of Leviticus, V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov. I remember, God says, I remember even when things go bad. I'm going to remember my covenant with Jacob, with Isaac, with Abraham. I'll remember the land. And there are many of the commentators talk about why we're giving the patriarchs' names in reverse of their birth order. Leave it right there. For the land will be forsaken. Make it up for a sabbatical year, being desolate of them, while they atone for their iniquity. So The people are going to be sent out of the land. And yet, here's the key verse 44, when the children of Israel are exiled. Yet even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or spurn them so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant to them, for I am their God. And that's the key. Even when we're kicked out of the land, God will be with us. I'll remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients, whom I freed from the land of Egypt in the sight of their nations to be their God, Ani Hashem. I am God. So that's the great promise. Even when things go wrong, even when you're banished from the land, I will be with you. I will not reject you. I am God. I am with you. That's the promise. So look at what the Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha HaKohen, Meir Simcha, Mem, Sin, Shin, Kohen, Chaf of Dvinsk. So he calls himself the Meshech Chachma. That's the acronym for his name. And so he says, Ha'inyan, we'll look at the English in a moment. Ha'inyan hu shenitbonen k'sab b'derechei hashgacha ha'elyona. We're looking a little bit in the way of, from the perspective of divine providence. Mashu chalavim, whatever we can understand. Ki kasher gazra chachma elyona, because when the upper wisdom, the divine wisdom decrees, Asher Yisrael, to do Bartzot Shanim Rabim Ma'od Ma'od, that when Israel is going to wander in different lands for many, many years, until the divine goals are achieved, until God's ready to bring us back to the land. Asher Yisrael, we skip a little bit. Asher Yisrael Yitkaimu Lagoy V'lo Yitpalu Ba'amim, when Israel is ready to be fulfilled as a nation and won't be lost and won't be immersed, won't be absorbed into the other nations. Ve'eira al-zeh. So how do you make this happen? How do you make sure that Yisrael yitkaimu lagoy? How do you make sure that you become a nation, that you are a nation, that you stay together? How do you make sure when you're banished from the land, when you don't have Israel, when you're not living in Israel, how do you make sure that you stay together? Ve'eira al-zeh gedolei ha'umah. So the great sages have dealt with this. La'asot b'zeh gedarim u'siagim. They made different boundaries and fences around the Torah to keep us together. So much of the decrees. Asher ha'umah titkaim b'sha'on galei hayam v'lo titba. The nation is going to be preserved. It's going to be preserved, floating on the water. V'lo titba b'mitzulat hasar shotef b'ruach hamitzvah kabir. When it's not going to be taken down by a hurricane. It's not going to be taken down by a storm on the sea, which is basically, we're thinking about Israel floating on a raft. The metaphor that he's referring to Israel, not in the land of Israel. The people of Israel who are in a foreign land are floating on a raft in the middle of a stormy sea. And how do you keep them on that raft? How do you keep us afloat and together so that we don't just drown in those waters and become just like part of the waters around us? How do you do that? And so he says that there are strategies. And so he says this is what. So the first one who gave us the direction in this way, who Avinu Hazaken Yaakov, was Jacob. He saw what was going to happen, chashav, and he thought, Asher im yesh 70 ish bagoy chazak v'amitz k'mitzrim milifnim halo yitbalu v'yitpatlu echad b'revot revav. If there are only 70 people, if we're coming down with such small numbers, they're going to be absorbed. They're going to become just like the nations around them. Chashav tachbula ve'etza. And so Jacob thought of a strategy, thought of an approach. Asher banav yu metzuyanim sham b'vigdehem, and he made sure that his children would be defined there, b'vigdehem, with their clothing, with the way that they dressed. They dressed as Jews, bishmotehem, with their names, v'lachein hayu Yisrael legoy bifnei atzmo, and that's why Israel was a nation amongst itself, because this was a strategy. This was a deliberate strategy, so as not to become one of the nations around us, but to maintain our own distinct identity. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest. He makes reference to other later examples of this, such as the 18 degrees that Ezra and the people of the Great Assembly made, all strategies to keep the people Jewish.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
Some of these seem to connect more strongly with identity than others. Like I questioned in my own look at these, at Rav Huna's 4, the Lashon Hara. One other set of reasons that is in the tradition is in Sefer HaAgadah. I happened to come across it because I'm doing some reading with a grandchild. And one of those is Lo bitlu et hamilah. They didn't stop doing circumcision, which I certainly could see as an identity building thing, and it's the symbol of the covenant.
Yeah, beautiful. That is another one of the attributes, and it's look. I think it's great we could focus on those 4 and analyze the 4. And I think there's a connection between language and Lashon Hara, right? That they didn't change their Lashon and they didn't speak Lashon Hara, right? So it's not only what they spoke, but how they spoke. That one could even be seen as a subset of the other. Yeah, so there are those which would you say name and milah would be of a similar nature. One's name and the Brit Milah, which are really core identity components, sure. and speech. Anyway, that's a great point. Thank you. Okay, and so this in the translation. Does he add anything? Okay, I think we've explained it pretty thoroughly, right? That the nation's spiritual giants were aware of the dangers of assimilation and made fences and restrictions with which the nation could exist in the crash of the ocean's waves and not sink into the stormy torrential abyss. Okay, that explains why the Midrash picks those 3, 4, whatever, 5 different examples. In one of the articles, they actually chart out all the different sources that say this is the reason that Israel was redeemed from Egypt, and which ones exist or which examples exist in which Midrash. But Brit Milah is certainly one of them. There is a famous article, and I always hesitate to say the word famous because it doesn't add anything to the description. It just maybe says that popularity is a quality, or it makes people feel bad for not knowing it. If it's so famous, then why don't you know it? So anyway, I use the word hesitatingly of famous. It's famous in certain circles. This is a very famous article. Not that any of us may have heard of it, but it's very famous. It's an article by Herschel Schachter from Yeshiva University, and the title is "The Mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael," the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, in which he explores. It's a very thorough article in which he explores lots of different approaches to the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz, of what it means to live in the land of Israel. And we're going to look at it was from 1984, and we are going to look at the concluding sentence, which he quotes what we just saw. Rav Meir Simcha HaKohen of Dvinsk, the Meshech Chachma, cites the words of the famous Midrash that the Jews merited redemption from Egypt because throughout their exile and enslavement, they preserved their names, their language, and their unique dress. In explaining the significance of these seemingly trifling mitzvot, why these mitzvot? Rav Meir Simcha writes that although all mitzvot are equally important in the eyes of Jewish law, must all be observed, from a historical perspective, some take on added significance. In certain times, some are going to be more important than others. Thus, outside of Israel, it became historically very important that the Jews retain their Hebrew names, tongue, and dress in order to combat the powerful forces of assimilation. Those are purposeful. Why those mitzvot? In this manner, every period of Jewish history has its own mitzvot of the hour. Today, when every Jew settling in Israel contributes measurably to the security and economy of the state and to the Jews in it, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael may indeed be called a mitzvah of the hour. He is saying something quite profound and dramatic. He is saying, you want to know how to preserve the identity of Israel, of the Jewish people, in the stormy seas of today, and what's happening in the world today outside the land. Maybe that our mitzvah is not our names and not our dress and not Lashon Hara and not, these things are all important, but maybe that's not the mitzvah that's going to make a difference. If we're going to keep the Jewish people together, maybe the mitzvah, he says, that's going to keep the Jewish people together, that's going to allow us to survive this period of time, is the mitzvah of Aliyah, is the mitzvah of living in Israel. It's a very, very dramatic say to say, if we were to write that midrash that we started off with, if we were to write it today, in what merit were the Jews saved from the gullus, from the exile that we're in right now? In what merit were we redeemed? You know, I can tell you why they were redeemed from Egypt, from the Egyptian exile. Why are we redeemed from the contemporary exile? So it could be, Rav Hershel Schachter suggests, it could be because they never gave up on the land of Israel and on living in the land of Israel. That was the mitzvah that kept us Jewish. That was the mitzvah that preserved our identity. I think it's a very, very strong and powerful approach. Sitting from the comfort of my office in Montreal, it's a difficult lesson to internalize. But perhaps this is it. Is that being in Israel, having a strong Israel, having good, strong people move to Israel, having us take this mitzvah not as just one of the 613, but as one that's crucial, that's essential to our Jewish identity and destiny. Maybe that's the mitzvah of the hour. Any questions or comments before we conclude with a segment of poetry, modern Israeli poetry? Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, this should be our last Yom Haatzmaut in Galut.
Amen. Amen.
If everybody decided, I mean, everybody Jewish, decided to move to Israel today,
Mhm.
I don't think we'd all fit in there. Would we?
Mhm.
It would grow to fit.
Yeah,
Pardon?
there's a great
That's a
midrash
good answer.
which talks about the land of Israel being compared to a deer's skin. Just as it stretches, so too the land will stretch. There's plenty of room in Israel. That's
So in other words, just put another seat at the table, it's going to work.
absolutely, absolutely,
A good way to think.
absolutely perfect. Okay, Amir Gilboa, who was born in Ukraine, and he wrote this powerful, in 1953 again, the beginning of the land, beginning of the state, wrote this very, very powerful poem, which we'll take a look at, and we'll talk a little bit about how it became very popular. Has anybody heard this poem or familiar with this? Okay, you'll be very familiar with it. By the time we conclude in 14 minutes, you'll be very familiar with this. Okay. Suddenly, we're going to see this refrain. I'm sorry, this is not the poem. The refrain is the way it appears in the song, but I'm not sure whether the refrain repeats itself in the original poem. But suddenly, pitom, we'll read at least this part in Hebrew. Pitom kam adam baboker. Suddenly, a man wakes up in the morning. Umargish kihu am, and feels that he is a nation. Umatchil alechet, and he starts to walk. Ulechol hanifgash bedarko, and to everyone he meets on his way, korehu, he calls shalom. That's it. Suddenly, a man wakes up in the morning. He feels he is a nation and begins to walk, and to all he meets on his way, he calls out shalom. What does that mean? It's talking about, I think it's speaking of the birth of Israel, but what's he adding to the conversation? What's he describing?
I think he's describing, it could be many things, but one thing that occurs to me is a generous spirit of feeling connection to other people around him who are part of the same nation. And he's happy and outgoing and confident.
Yeah, there's something, the word pitom, suddenly he wakes up. I don't know about you. Does anybody here suddenly wake up? Yeah, you get up, you're groggy or whatever. You slowly wake up. Here, this jumps out of bed. Pitom, and you're going to hear the music, how it said. You're going to hear the energy in the music. But he gets up. What does it mean? He feels he's a nation. Umargish ki hu am. I find that such a powerful phrase.
He feels comfortable in himself and his surroundings.
Mm-hmm.
He feels no out of placeness.
Yeah, maybe he feels a sense of togetherness, of connection.
Yeah.
I think, Pitom, if you look at the history of the Jewish people, you have, 1900 years of Galut, and the 50 years leading up to the birth of Israel is pretty sudden. From an oppressed people to suddenly making a nation. That's Zionism. Right. And the very short history of it until it actually happened. But then once you are a nation, it's Jews looking around and saying, oh, look, hi, India, hi, UK, hi, USA. We're all nations together and we're all the same.
Right. Beautiful.
And the irony is, I suppose, coming further on.
The irony? Where's the irony?
When we find out that we're not the same.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hi, Rabbi. I think, to me, I'm looking, begins to walk. When a child walks, they crawl or whatever, and then they begin to walk. They sense a sense of independence and strength, and they're ready to explore the world like on their own versus, having to carry it or crawl. They're walking. They're on their own.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there's a sense of independence. That's great. Yeah, good. First steps. Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, let's go. I don't want to run out of time because I do want to listen to this song and speak a little bit about the meaning. Corn stalks are growing up behind him. Between the cracks in the sidewalks and lilac trees shower down rich fragrance on his head. The dewdrops are sparkling. The hills are a myriad of rays. You feel the spring. You feel the hope they will give birth to a canopy of sunlight for his wedding. It's so exciting. This is just full of, you couldn't write a stanza more full of energy and hope. And he laughs with the strength of the generations and the mountains, and the shamed wars bow down to the ground. To the glory of 1,000 years flowing forth from the hiding places, 1,000 young years in front of him, like a cold brook, like a shepherd's song, like a branch. Okay, I want to leave it at this because this is a song of extraordinary hope. We're going to look at how it was used and then how it was used again. So basically, this remained in the realm of poetry, of hopeful poetry, until in 1973, Shlomo Artzi, the very famous Israeli musician, he recorded a version of this, and I'm trying to, let me open it in a moment. Here we go. We're gonna look at Shlomo Artzi. Let me stop sharing this and start sharing this. Here we go. Okay, you see it? Great. So listen to the, I wish I could share, I wish I had the sharing capacity to put the words and the video together, but listen to the energy of the music. Listen to this from the perspective, and this is being written, this song is being written 25 years into the state of Israel's existence. Think about this from a young nation and from the hope that's existing in the youth of that nation.
פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש כי הוא עם ומתחיל ללכת ולכל הנפגש בדרכו קורא ושלום פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש כי הוא עם ומתחיל ללכת ולכל הנפגש בדרכו קורא ושלום.
Okay, so just what happened there, just in that first, he repeats the first stanza, suddenly a man wakes up, and just keep in mind, listening to how he expresses this, first he sings it alone. First it's a solo. And then the second time around, the backup singers join him, and it becomes more of a group expression of, hey, look, we're up, we're walking, and look, we're greeting each other with shalom. There's the corn stalks growing up behind him. And the lilac tree is showering down the fragrance. The dewdrops, the hills, the rays. Chupat shemesh, a canopy of sunlight. Okay, so we're going to stop it right there just to show, and you know what, I'll put the link in the chat if you want to get the full experience. And then how does a song grow, and in particular in Israel, how does a song grow in that way? How has it become part of the culture? So that's the Shlomo Artzi version. How does it become part of the culture? And so let's take a look at the next. What's the next stage of evolution? You have a dance. Okay, that's anyway part of becoming part of the Israel canon. I'm very moved by seeing this Rikud Am, this kind of national style of dancing, and how these words of hope become internalized in the movement of the people. In the protests in the last decade, the social justice protests, this song took on new light, and new life. And I wanted to just share one other version of this song, which I was very moved by. And we'll let me just I'll put the this version as well in the chat, the link to it. But take a look at this next version, which was published in 2017, I guess, but it was a way of taking some of the ancient and canonical quotes from the land of Israel and incorporating it into this song. So we'll take a look, and we'll close. We'll conclude with this. Here we go.
אנו חברי מועצת העם, תוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עשרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל. פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש קיומן, הוא מתחיל ללכת, וכל הנפגש דרכו קורא ושלום. פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש קיומן, הוא מתחיל ללכת, וכל הנפגש דרכו.
They're showing clips from the protests, the social justice protests, the equality, the
ישראל תהיה פתוחה. תשקוד על פיתוח הארץ לטובת כל יושביה. תהא מושתתת על יסודות החירות, הצדק והשלום. לאור חזונם של נביאי ישראל.
פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש קיומה, מתחיל ללכת, הנפגש בדרכו, אומר שלום. מדינת ישראל תקיים שוויון זכויות חברתי ומדיני, בלי הבדל דת, גזע ומין. לכל האזרחים תבטיח חופש דת, מצפון, לשון, חינוך, תרבות. בקיצור, חופש. פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש נראה, הוא מתחיל ללכת, כל הנפגש בדרכו, אומר שלום. יד שלום ושכנות טובה לכל המדינות השכנות בעמיהן, וקוראים להן לשיתוף פעולה ועזרה הדדית עם העם היהודי העצמאי בארצו. זה מה שנקרא שלום. פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש נראה, מתחיל ללכת, כל הנפגש בדרכו, אומר שלום. פתאום קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש קיומם, הוא מתחיל ללכת, ולכל הנפגש בדרכו, אומר שלום. וכל הנפגש בדרכו, אומר שלום.
Okay, thank you for your patience, and I was just very moved by seeing that, and just to reflect for a moment, you know, if this is the way that we're interpreting the birth of the state, right? Of course, this is not the way it happened. It didn't. A group of people didn't just wake up one morning and feel that it's a nation and go walk outside and say shalom, shalom, everybody. You're talking about, you know, a 2,000-year history of dreaming and of struggling, and this is being written, you know, less than a decade after the Holocaust. You know, 10 years before, Jews are being gassed and murdered in the camps. And to write the history of Israel in a way that's so positive, like, whoa, just woke up in the morning, I feel like I'm a nation today. I'm going to go outside. Hey, shalom, shalom. That's obviously not the way it happened, but it's a vision for an energy and for a positivity of founding a nation that's built on the back of suffering and hardship and tears and slavery and oppression. And yet there's a way to have a people in which you can jump out of bed and bounce around and skip outside and shalom, shalom. That there's a way to live a life with such positivity. And I think one of the reasons that this song was revitalized for the social justice protests was as a way of kind of recapturing that optimism, that it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be broken. We can celebrate some really good things. Pitom kam adam baboker baboker. This is called one of the titles of this is Shir Boker Baboker. This is the song of the morning, song of like every morning, kind of get up and hope and love, and it's all good. And the energy, I love this song. The song just pulls me in. Of like, this is what a nation can be. This is a side of Israel, and this is what, you know, this song was kind of going through I knew we were going to share this today, obviously, but while marching down St. Catherine Street today and hearing all the modern Israeli music, but I also was thinking about, you know, you could also walk outside and, you know, to everyone you see, you say, shalom, shalom, this is great, look at us. We woke up, we felt like we're a nation, and look, we're a nation. Isn't that amazing? How cool. It's just a very positive and exciting approach. So that's my offering today for Yom Haatzmaut. I hope we had a little taste of Israel. Certainly appropriate for this day, and a Chag Sameach, and thank you for giving me an excuse to wear this tie for an additional hour today.
You put the song in.
Amazing.
That was delightful. Thank you so
It
much.
was
Thank
so uplifting.
Yes. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. All the
Okay,
best,
Shabbat
everybody.
shalom to everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, and Chag
Take care.
Sameach and
Chag
Shabbat
Sameach.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Chag
Shabbat
sameach.
shalom.